For Indigenous peoples, reconciliation is about restoring the relationships that make us Indigenous. It's an act of undoing settler colonial worlds.
Has Canada achieved reconciliation? I think that depends on who you're asking.
I think we've achieved frustration with the lack of action and the continuing gulf between rhetoric and reality.
Canada is very far from achieving reconciliation in really any way, shape, or form.
The Supreme Court of Canada views reconciliation as reconciling the assertion of Crown sovereignty over Indigenous lands with the reality that Indigenous peoples have always had a right to the land.
Fundamentally, then, it becomes trying to reconcile a right with a lie. The right is the interest in the land. The lie is that we'll find a way to circumvent recognizing it. Actually, we're not trying to reconcile. We're just trying to colonize in a more feel-good way.
In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC, began sharing the story of residential schools in Canada.
The truth of residential schools in this country is a story about the resilience of children.
And Canada seemed very committed to the cause.
I give you my word that we will renew and respect that relationship.
But that's not exactly how things have played out. The TRC implemented 94 calls to action. These are actionable policy recommendations that have brought about real change, like the federal acknowledgement of Indigenous language rights, the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls inquiry, and the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. But progress has been slow.
The first 42 of those calls deal with the legacy of Indian residential schools. They are the calls to action that, if implemented, would ease the burden and challenges that Indigenous peoples face in this country today. At this point, we are only at 13 of the 94 calls to action implemented, several of which were not actually implemented by the Canadian government and were implemented by church groups. Other calls to action that have been completed are more about managing Canada's public image rather than stopping the violence or the structural harms that Indigenous peoples are currently facing.
Reconciliation really is a first strong step towards decolonization, which is actually returning resources, returning land, returning governance authorities to Indigenous peoples. It is not about that dictionary definition of reconciliation, which is what I think the Canadian public often thinks about. Can't we all just get along? No, not when you're still holding all the stolen stuff, not when you're having racism in healthcare, racism in housing, extreme disproportionate incarceration of Indigenous people. There's a lot of disadvantage and violence that Indigenous people are still subject to in Canada.
The word reconcile implies that we are coming back to a relationship that was good in the first place. For many Indigenous peoples, there was never a good relationship with European settlers and the Canadian state to begin with.
The sort of Canadian power structure has taken on reconciliation begrudgingly as a sort of concession to Indigenous people, and it probably feels like a lesser concession than making real and substantive change. And I think they have to make this concession in some ways because Indigenous people are a relatively significant proportion of the Canadian population.
For Canadians, reconciliation is about interrogating the systems of oppression that enable your presence as Canadians. So that looks like interrogating white supremacy, capitalism, settler colonialism, invasion, oppressive structures, patriarchy, all of these ways that Canada was able to create a foothold in these lands needs to be reckoned with.
Very few things are changing on the ground for Indigenous people. Indigenous land defenders are still forced to be there on the front lines, defending their land against militarized police forces.
This is sovereign but Jordan land!
There's the kind of surface reconciliation that's like, we said our land acknowledgement, we've included you in the room, you're here. And then there's people who are really committed to what would it look like if we lived under the laws of Indigenous peoples in this territory? Or what would it look like if I paid my taxes to the nation whose territory I'm on? That's a different kind of reconciliation, I think, that's not actually in the broader discourse, right?
I think what stands in the way of real reconciliation is a lack of political will. Indigenous people for decades have been told, we'd love to help you solve all these problems. You have a boiled water advisory, love to help you out, but sorry, we don't have the money.
Reconciliation itself gets framed as an individual endeavor, and it's not. It is a systemic change. It is a public shift toward respecting Indigenous nationhood and our presence, our laws, our languages, and who we are as pre-existing nations. It's entirely possible to respect the work of the survivors and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and respect where we're at so far in Canada when it comes to reconciliation. It's also okay to say that it doesn't stop there.
You're not simply going to say, okay, the past is the past, we're sorry, and keep all the spoils and then keep all the governance authority and think that you've achieved reconciliation. That's just not the case, and Indigenous people are not fooled.
Those are Indigenous lands. Indigenous laws exist. Recognize that. If reconciliation is making you feel good, you're doing it wrong.